Well, welcome everybody to our first Third Thursday Web Forum of 2019. It's been a while since we've all been together between the holidays at the end of 2018 and then the shutdown last month, so it's really great to see everybody on the line today. I'm Hillary Morris, and I work on user support and communications for both the South Atlantic and Southeast Conservation Blueprints. We host this web forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m., and it's intended to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of our region. So here is our usual agenda. I'll just start out by introducing our presenter. Then we'll hear from our speaker. We'll have time for Q&A and discussion at the end. And then I'll take a moment to preview next month's webinar and share some updates from Blueprint staff. So as usual, I'm going to put us in silent mode so that we don't have any background noise distracting us. So that means if you need to speak up at any time, you'll need to press *6 to unmute your line, or you can always post questions using the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on that during the talk. Just remember that if you want everyone to be able to see your question, you need to select everyone from the drop-down menu in the chat box. So before I put us in silent mode, does anybody want to speak up with questions or comments? Okie doke.
The conference is now in silent mode.
So today we're going to be hearing from Greg Dobson, who's the Director of Geospatial Technology at the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, or NEMAC. He's going to be talking to us about the human infrastructure component of a NIFWF coastal resilience project that's looking at how nearby natural areas can benefit infrastructure for people. I'm paraphrasing a good bit, Greg, so I hope that's at least reasonably accurate. So with that, Greg, you can take it away. Just hit *6 to unmute your line, and I will go ahead and pass you the presenter ball.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Great. Let me share my screen. Is that coming across?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Hillary, for that introduction. Like she said, I'm Greg Dobson with UNC Asheville's NEMAC. So we're an applied research center on campus at UNC Asheville. We've been in existence for about 15 years now. We do a lot of work with NOAA, with Forest Service, with a lot of other local, regional, and state agencies. We do a lot of work with nonprofits, such as the project I'm going to be describing today. And the bottom line to a lot of what we do is taking complex and scientific data and information and turning that into useful decision support tools that people can make better decisions off of. A lot of that involves geospatial technologies. That's largely what I do, and definitely feeds into the project I'm going to be talking about today, developing regional GIS-based coastal resilience assessments. So this is a project that we've been doing with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NIFWF. I'm not sure if many of you all are familiar with NIFWF. They are a large nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. They administer lots of different grant funding programs. They really strive to put a lot of projects on the ground to help fund projects that can benefit fish and wildlife habitat throughout the U.S. And kind of how this came about, back in 2013, after Hurricane Sandy, DOI actually chose NIFWF to administer their Hurricane Sandy Coastal Resilience Fund. So they had like $100 million that they wanted to award to put projects on the ground to help with recovery and restoration type efforts all along the Northeast. And what folks at NIFWF realized is that they didn't have a good tool, a good set of data to tell them where those projects would be best located on the ground and where they could get maximum benefit for putting those projects on the ground. So they came up with this idea of building some resilience hubs and really trying to hone in on particular areas and understand what influence a particular project might have and map this out across a portion of the Northeast. But that kind of rolled along, and they wanted to greatly expand that and not only account for where fish and wildlife is going to benefit, but also where they can increase human community resilience. So that's really the basis of what this project is then. We started working on this in fall of 2015, so we're about 3.5 years into this project. And again, the key goal is to identify areas on the landscape where implementation of restoration projects and other conservation actions will not only benefit human community resilience, but also fish and wildlife habitat. Some things that make this different from other coastal assessments that have been done in the past is this one accounts not only for what's going on right along that ribbon of coastline, but also inland storm events as well. And so you'll see in a few minutes when I start talking about the footprint of the area that we've been working in. This could be for things that are happening right along the beachfront, but it could also be for flood events that are occurring, well inland, but still within sort of that coastal designated watershed zone. Another goal of this project was to make these regional assessments contiguous and standardized across the whole U.S. coastline. And so you'll see in a little bit that we have completed this for the whole U.S. coastline, and it's standardized. It's the same no matter if you're working in Wilmington or if you're in San Francisco. The data is the same, the methodology is the same, and you can make direct comparisons between those two regions. And then a final component, which I won't go into too much today, was NIFWF selected these different targeted watersheds up and down the East Coast, and there's one on the West Coast where they really wanted to do a deeper dive assessment, scale down the models a little bit. They actually partnered with NatureServe to do a lot of that work, and we worked in tandem with each other in collecting a lot of the regional data and local data, and then they were able to scale some of that down. And so that was another effort that was kind of going on, or has been going on at the same time we've been doing our more regional focused work. So this project was broken up into quite a few different regions. The South Atlantic actually was one of the first regions that we did back in fall of 2015. And then we moved into the North Atlantic, the Gulf Coast, California, and finally the Pacific Northwest. And obviously we learned a lot along the way. We continued to refine our methodology. We actually came back to the South Atlantic last year and did an update based on some things that we were learning, some additional data sets that we had acquired. So some of you guys might remember there was, let me skip ahead here. The targeted watersheds. So these are the targeted watersheds that NIFWF and the NIFWF team decided they wanted to do these deeper dive analyses like I was talking about. And some of you guys might remember Cape Fear was actually the first one that was chosen. So again, back in late 2015, 2016 time frame, there were a series of workshops that were held up and down the Cape Fear. At that time, they were actually working with a different contractor, a group out of Wilmington called Dial Cordy, to kind of lead that effort. And again, the goal was collecting more local scale data, really trying to understand the local problems and come up with a series of models that would help, indicate where, again, restoration projects would have that dual benefit of providing human community resilience as well as fish and wildlife habitat. And then as NatureServe came on board and did the rest of the workshops, rest of the watersheds and running workshops in those watersheds, that methodology continued to be refined. And so we've actually come back to the Cape Fear just in recent months, and we've updated it to be consistent with the other watersheds up and down the East Coast as well. So let me dive in here and talk some about the modeling that we've done, the indices that we've come up with, and kind of one of the main components that we've built is this community exposure index, and it's got two main parts. So again, we were looking at all coastal flood related hazards. And so we built what we called a threat index, where we assembled a lot of different data sets. I'll go through those in just a second, that would indicate coastal flooding type hazards. And then we have what we call our community asset index, which is key human assets, population, social vulnerability type stuff. And we combine those two together then to create our final community exposure index. And I'll go through each of these and unpack them just a little bit. So this is our threat index. Again, we wanted to account for all coastal flood threats. So we look at, some of the usual things, of course, like the NOAA sea level rise data and NOAA storm surge information. We've got the FEMA floodplain data in here, but then we also look at things like soil characteristics, soils that are either highly erodible or poorly drained. We're also looking at, what if we just have heavy precipitation events, as we often get, and, where's that rainwater collecting? So we take into account, slope, areas of low slope. And then we also look at geologic stressors. Now, those obviously have varying effects depending on where you are along the coastline, a little more of an issue on the west coast and even parts of the northeast coast. But we take in those types of hazards as well. And so we combine all these data sets together to create what we call our final threat index. And so with our threat index, if you zoom into a particular location and you determine what the value is on that particular place on the ground, what's happening here, for instance, let's say you get a high value in your threat index. Well, what would be happening there is that particular point on the ground would be in maybe a 2-foot, storm surge scenario. Maybe it's in a 1-foot sea level rise scenario. The soils are poorly drained or highly erodible. It's really flat. And so all of those values are going to add up to create, a high value then in our threat index. Now, we're not weighting any of these things. Always get the question, are we weighting any of our inputs? And we really don't. The only thing we do with sea level rise and storm surge in particular is, we give a 1-foot sea level rise scenario a higher rank just because a 1-foot sea level rise is more likely to occur than, say, a 5-foot sea level rise. And same thing with storm surge. We give a Category 1 storm surge scenario a higher rank simply because that's more likely to occur than, say, a Category 5 storm surge. So that's our threat index. And then we have our community asset index. And so what NIFWIF was really interested in is identifying where are the key assets, what are the key infrastructure that a community would need to get back up and going immediately following a major storm event or a hurricane. And so we pulled in things such as population density, social vulnerability. We used the EPA's EJ Screen data set for that. Critical facilities includes things such as the location of fire and police stations, hospitals, schools, and then critical infrastructure includes evacuation, hurricane evacuation routes, rail lines, the location of, say, wastewater treatment plants, power plants, those sorts of pieces that, again, a community would really need to get back up and going following an event. So just like with our threat index, we add all of those together. We don't really do any weighting, and we get a combined community asset index, which is telling us, if you look at the range of colors here, light to dark blue, what that indicates is areas of either a higher concentration of community assets or a lower concentration of community assets. So we then take these two and combine them together, and that gives us what we call our final community exposure index right here. And I should say, too, that all of this work is being done at a fairly high resolution. 30-meter resolution, yes, you can do higher resolution modeling, but again, we wanted to be able to do this consistent at a regional scale and for the whole U.S. And so 30 meters, a pretty standard resolution, a pretty standard input from a lot of our data sets. So that's kind of the resolution of the models that we were creating here. And so with this community exposure index, again, we combine our two input indices, and what this is telling us, where we see the darker browns, those are areas of higher exposure. And so what must be happening in those areas is not only do we have a high concentration of coastal flood threats, but also a high concentration of assets. And so I get asked sometimes, well, let's look at this area here where we see some greens, and someone will say, well, I know that area has a lot of flood threats. It's impacted by coastal storms, et cetera. Well, yes, that might be true, but if there are no community assets there that are being impacted, then we consider that to be a lower exposure. In other words, if an area isn't experiencing a negative impact, if community assets aren't experiencing a negative impact from the storm, then it's going to get a lower exposure. So basically the idea with the Community Exposure Index is just to help direct attention to where, again, people and assets are most exposed to coastal flood threats. And again, at a 30-meter resolution, it works really well, at a local level, at a community level, but it also works really well at a regional level. It's consistent, it's standard, so no matter if you're in Portland, Maine, or Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Texas, everything's going to be the same. The scale of the data is going to be the same. You're going to be able to make the same types of decisions no matter where you're using the data along the U.S. coastline. So the next part of this assessment process was to develop a regional fish and wildlife index. And I say regional fish and wildlife index because, again, at these local targeted watersheds, NatureServe did a much finer resolution of some of their fish and wildlife modeling. And NIFWF is interested in that for some decisions they might make in those particular watersheds. But, obviously there's only 8 of those watersheds, and so we wanted to be able to have a regional approach to that for the rest of the coastline. So we put together this regional fish and wildlife index, and it's divided into 2 parts. We have an aquatic index and a terrestrial index. And with both of these, we were relying heavily on, NIFWF wanted us to use the NatureServe HUC level data that they have that indicates rarity-weighted richness of species. So I don't know if you're familiar with the NatureServe data. It is proprietary data, so different organizations have different levels of access to it. NIFWF was able to get access to the HUC-10 level data that they have. And basically what it does is by watershed, they have a count for the richness of species within that watershed. So we use that as kind of the base for both our aquatic and terrestrial indices. But then they wanted to add in additional components as well. And I should say that NOAA was part of the advisory committee for this, so they obviously had a lot of input. And, they wanted to include, for instance, some of the NOAA critical habitat, the essential fish areas, the habitat areas of particular concern. So we added those in as overlays with the NatureServe data as well. And then on the terrestrial side, NIFWF was really interested in birds, so they wanted us to include the bird life, important bird areas, or IBAs. So we added those as well. And so, again, what we're getting here is, we're identifying which watersheds have a higher concentration of, aquatic and terrestrial species. And that's what this combined index then tells us, and, where are higher or lower concentrations of fish and wildlife species up and down the coast. So then the final part of this was to develop a set of resilience hubs that could really help NIFWF and others that are using this start to hone in and understand where there might be good locations on the ground to start thinking about restoration projects or other conservation efforts. And so this was a process that they had, started building when they were doing the Hurricane Sandy relief work in the Northeast, and they wanted us to kind of build that out, for the rest of the U.S. Coastline. And so the idea with these resilience hubs, again, is to really identify and prioritize which landscapes would be good, could build resilience for, again, both community assets, which I've been talking about, as well as fish and wildlife habitat. So we're looking at, areas of large contiguous tracts of open land, areas that could provide buffering to storms, areas that might already have some sort of protection but would be suited for, enhancement of that or expansion of that. And so a couple of data sets that we really relied on to kind of drive this, so we're using the Protected Areas database, the USGS PADIS data set. This includes all lands that are in some sort of protected status, whether it's federal, state, or local protected lands, state parks, U.S. forest lands, whatever it might be. It also includes conservation, easements, and other types of locally protected lands. So we use that as sort of the base to think about where, these places on the ground might be. And then, NIFWF was, interested in not just lands that were already in some sort of protected status, but they recognized that, where there are large and contiguous open lands, even if they were private lands, there still could be an opportunity to put projects on the ground. So we used the National Land Cover data set and pulled out open and natural land cover, really looked at high densities of those, and combine that as well with a green infrastructure data set that Esri, if you're familiar with the GIS company Esri, has. So we kind of combine those two together to indicate open and natural lands. And so once we identify where those areas are, we then compare that with our Fish and Wildlife Combined Index as well as our Community Exposure Index. And then we ran a series of zonal statistics on that to be able to come up with a rank, if you will, or a score of each of these resilience hubs, each of these polygons that are on the ground, to give them a score to then indicate which ones have a high value or a low value. And basically what this is telling us is if we see a high value in a resilience hub, that's telling us that, okay, there is a lot of fish and wildlife habitat there. It does have a high community exposure value, meaning that there are community assets that are highly exposed to coastal flood threats, and that might be an area that folks want to think about, putting projects on the ground to hopefully increase that resilience and increase that fish and wildlife habitat in those areas. So that's a lot, just a quick recap, and then I'll go into just a couple of case studies that I have. Again, we start off with our threat index and an asset index, and we combine those together to create what we call our community exposure index. And then we also have our regional fish and wildlife index. We compare those two on top of protected lands to create then a final set of resilience hubs that can, direct attention to where, again, projects could be located and have that dual benefit. So we have kind of dived into some recent storm events and tried to take a look at how well this was working. So, Hurricane Sandy, obviously, big event in the Northeast, and so here we're looking at this is US 30, which goes out to some of the islands there in New Jersey, and we can see our community exposure index here and indicating a pretty high value along some of those transportation corridors. Here's a picture of that same route. We can see that it was obviously heavily damaged. This is one of the main entry points to Atlantic City. And this was just a Category 1 storm, surge, obviously, but major damage. And so that's, pretty good. NIFWF's pretty pleased with the validation there of how the models are working. Here is Hurricane Harvey in 2017. This was Buffalo Bayou and Houston. Pretty stark difference there between what a normal view of that bayou looks like compared to post-Harvey. And, here we're looking at some of the threat inputs of the flood-prone areas, as well as population density and understanding how those two kind of overlay with one another. And, we can see that, there's a lot of population density there, indicating a high value in our community exposure index, driven by, this floodplain threat that was there. Low slope in some of those areas, impacted with heavy precipitation, obviously, from the storm. So that was working good. And then also, just this past fall with Hurricane Florence in Wilmington, this is Front Street, a couple of images there of pre- and post-flood conditions. We can see in our community exposure index, we're getting a pretty high values, obviously, a lot of infrastructure right there, a lot of community assets. And then we can compare that, say, with our population, with storm surge, and with even just looking at soils that are occasionally, not soils, but our combined floodplain input, which does include, so with our floodplain input, we have obviously the floodway, the 100-year and the 500-year inputs, but then we also add to that soils that either frequently flood or occasionally flood as well. And so we can see that flood input as being a pretty high value along that area. Oh, and here's another look at some of the resilience hubs that are around kind of the downtown Wilmington area, and we can see a lot of those have a medium to high value. So as folks start to think about, locations of, potential restoration projects, we can see that there are a lot of lands that are either already protected, or there are some good open space lands, in and around Wilmington that are obviously are highly exposed to these coastal flood hazards. So some next steps. We are in the process of finalizing an interactive web tool, and I'll actually bring it up in just a minute and show you guys what that looks like. So we're going to have kind of the way this is going to be disseminated when everything goes public, which hopefully will be early to mid-spring. The shutdown kind of delayed that a little bit, but we're hoping to get all of this out. We've got final reports that are being reviewed, the data sets, all the data that we used in the assessment is going to be available. And then you'll be able to access that data. You can either download the data and work with it in your own system if you want to, but we're also going to have this interactive web tool that allow you to interact, explore, and even do some simple analyses with the data. And so this has kind of been everything I've described. The project up to date has been what we've kind of called phase one of the assessment project. And so NIFWF has just received funding from NOAA to continue this effort, and we're going to do what's called phase two of the assessment, where we're going to expand it to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands in the South Pacific, Hawaii, and Alaska. And this work is going to be starting this spring and going, into next year, into 2020. And then a couple other things that we'll be doing. For instance, this fall we'll be doing a refresh of all of the models that we have developed so far. So as new data sets, one of the ideas in building this assessment is to make it very much a living and dynamic assessment, so that as new models and data become available, everything just can be very easily updated with that latest information. If there's new sea level rise scenarios, for instance, or whatever it might be, we can swap out the old data and feed in the new data to update the model. So we'll be doing that this fall for everything that's been done to date. And then in fall of 2021, we'll do another update for sort of the phase two level of assessments. So with that, I'll say thanks, and maybe what I'll do is pause here for any questions that we might have, and then if we have a few minutes, I can pull up the web tool and give you just a real quick demo of that. I hate doing live demos with web tools, but we'll give it a go.
Yeah, that sounds great, Greg. Thanks. Fabulous talk. We have one question already from the chat box that I'll go ahead and share to kick us off, and everyone can be thinking about any other questions that they'd want to ask. One person asking if this is part of the Army Corps of Engineers vision meeting that is scheduled for later this month. They're doing this South Atlantic Division study on addressing coastal storm risks. I kind of thought they were separate, but could you speak to that?
Sure. So I'm actually not completely familiar with that effort, but I imagine that is, I think what's going on there is, so the Army Corps did a major Northeast study that they wrapped up pretty recently. And so as I understood, there was going to be an effort to then do that same sort of thing in the South Atlantic. So we actually did, there is an Army Corps rep that has been on the advisory committee that NIFWF established for this. So NIFWF put together a technical advisory committee that included some NOAA staff, one or two people from Army Corps, NIFWF, and I think there was one other organization, I can't remember, but we certainly did reference that Northeast Army Corps study that was done They had, that the purpose of that study was slightly different than what NIFWF wanted to get out of this assessment. So there are some differences, but we also did, reference some of their modeling and tried to replicate some of what they had done using some of their methodology as well. So the short answer, I'm not, up on the event that's happening at the end of this month, but that might be something we want to follow up on.
Yeah, it seems like maybe separate things, but a lot of good opportunities for cross-pollination. The chat gave some extra information about that I can send to you, Greg.
Okay.
In case you're interested. Any other questions? I might go ahead and take us out of silent mode here, y'all, so it's easier for us to talk to one another. Hang on.
The conference is now in talk mode.
So now you can go ahead and talk freely just using the mute button on your phone. Does anyone else want to chime in with a question, or you're always welcome to use the chat box too?
Hey, Greg, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Rick Gerber. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency. I have a general question. You said that you're going to be rolling it out onto the interactive tool. Is the data available currently?
The data is not available yet, but it will be. Initially, that was going to be March. Obviously, that's gotten pushed back a little bit. So I think they're now saying April-May timeframe. All of the data that I have shown will be available. All of the models will be available for anyone to download and, like I said, pull into your own GIS application. So,
the reason I ask, I'm working actually with the sustainability advisor down in Tallahassee for the Hurricane Michael, and certainly the coastal issues that they're looking at are sort of some stormwater management and green infrastructure, and it sounds like this would be an opportunity to utilize the information that you have to help them prioritize where they're working.
Sure.
And I was wondering, is there any way, they're kind of doing that strategic planning now. I was at a meeting yesterday, and they're starting to line up their sort of their long-range plan. Is there any way to get access to the information prior to?
Rick, I tell you what, if we can follow up email, we can certainly, I can take that back to NIFWF. There has been some cases where we've let some folks have some early access to the data. Really at this point it's final. They haven't wanted to give that final sign off on it. But that may very well be possible. So let's follow up offline and.
I can connect the two of you via email after this web forum, if you like.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Because that's exactly what this is intended for. Is for communities to have sort of this is not meant. This assessment is obviously it's at a sort of a broad level. It's not meant to make engineering decisions off of or those sorts of things, but at the very least to allow the kind of initial planning that you were just describing in the wake of an event such as the storms there on the Gulf Coast this past fall. So yeah, I'll look into that.
Good question, Rick.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else want to chime in? Well, we could go ahead and do a live demo potentially, Greg, and then circle back with everyone. And
sure.
Anything else?
Yeah, let me pull this up here. Is that coming across?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, and I can't promise that we're actively trying to wrap this up. So it is possible that our developer is working on this. I forgot to tell them ahead of time that I might try to show it. So we'll see. But again, the idea with this web tool is to give users access to the data, users that might not be GIS folks or have access to GIS software, but to give them the opportunity to at the very least view the data, explore their areas of interest, but there's a few different analyses that we can do, and I'll try to demonstrate that. But then also this is going to be a platform for downloading the data too, so I'll show that in just a second. But when you come to the site here, I'll zoom in to an area of interest. I'll zoom in to Wilmington, for instance, and one of the things that you can do, obviously all the data layers are here that I've been talking about are here in the map layer list. So I could turn on the community exposure index and hit the little drop down there to see the range of values. I could, click the little identify button there to just get some basic information about what that layer is. And so I'm going to zoom on in. And then one of the things that I could do is, if I wanted to understand better what the what that resilience score might be for a particular area, I could click draw on that, and I'm just going to draw a little area here, a little box, and then it's going to run a little process behind the scenes. We'll see if this works. Hopefully so. I will say the first one, for whatever reason, usually takes a few seconds, and then the second one's a lot faster. And so what this is telling me here then, let's say I'm interested in maybe doing a project here in this area just south of Wilmington. I want to do some kind of conservation effort here, and this is just for demonstration. I can get some further details about that particular area. So I can see in this area, for instance, that I get actually a pretty high aquatic value from our aquatic index, kind of a medium terrestrial value. My community exposure is somewhat high, driven by higher threat inputs. Not a lot of community assets there. There are no resilience hubs in that particular location, but that's okay. But then if I wanted to compare that to another area, I could just draw another little box here. Maybe I'm interested in doing something on Wrightsville Beach. And it's going to run the same statistics behind the scenes there. And I get another area, so I can compare these two particular areas here. I can see, threat inputs are a lot higher. There is some resilience hubs in that location. They have a low score. But then, I could download, if I wanted to download this information, I could download it as a graph. I click download there. I could just, not a graph. I could download it as a table to further interact with that on my own, my own system. I'm going to remove those areas. And then another thing you could do is if you had a shapefile defining, an area that you were interested in, you could upload that and do the same thing that I was just talking about. And then another thing, if I go to this other tab, where should I do a resilience project? If you had no idea where you might want to do a project, but you knew that there's these resilience hubs on the ground, and you'd like to maybe use one of those resilience hubs to think about a project, I'll draw a little larger area. And then what this is going to do is tell me, okay, in that area I just drew, where are the resilience hubs? And what is the score and the inputs of those? And it organizes these with the highest scored resilience hub first. So I can see this resilience hub number 14480 here. So that's telling me again, it has a high score, high threat inputs. It has a fairly high community exposure index. And I can just go down the list and start to look at these. Again, I could download that as a table if I wanted to look at it offline. So this could at least give you some idea of where you might want to do a project. We've got some case studies here that you can walk through, kind of what I was showing in an interactive way if you wanted to do that. And then also the data is all here too. So if you want to download, for instance, the community exposure index, if you want to download the community asset and threat indices, you can do that. And then a lot of the inputs are here as well. So all the data will be available. And then I think the goal, so this is just kind of some information about the assessment, and I think they may actually post the final reports here as well. So that's the web tool. Again, this is going to be, a live tool. You don't have to log in or anything. It's going to be available hopefully in the coming months.
Looks great. Love the upload a shapefile feature. That's something that we want to be able to do on our simple viewer. That's a really nice touch.
Yep. Thanks. Any questions about that?
No, not hearing any additional questions.
Okay.
Well, this is Rick. I've always got questions. I'll ask one more, Greg.
That's fine.
If I saw on your hurricane list, do you have anything for Michael or Irma up on there yet?
We don't. We were doing something with Michael. I need to check on the status of that. And we haven't done anything with Irma, but that's not to say we can't. But no, we haven't done anything with those just yet. I think we were doing something with Michael though. I need to check on the status of that.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly more interested in Michael personally.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can follow up on that offline as well.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, well, if not, I think I'm going to go ahead and take the presenter power back here for a sec. We've got some interesting updates to share from South Atlantic Blueprint staff, but as always, we'll pause again at the end for any additional questions. So if something occurs to you in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat box or hang on to it. I'm going to share my screen one more time. As a preview of what to expect next month, our next web forum will be on March 21st. It'll be the same time, same connection information as today. You're going to be hearing from me, actually, about the long-awaited online guide to using the Southeast and the South Atlantic blueprints. This is something we've been working on and talking about for months now. We've given a couple web forums sharing some of the case studies that are going to be featured in this guide about how folks are using the blueprint to inform decisions and gaining funding. So I'm very pleased to announce that these guides will be going out in the March newsletter. If you're on the South Atlantic newsletter list, you'll get a notice about that. And on this web forum, we're going to be taking an in-depth look at these guides. So in terms of what is a user guide for the blueprint, think of them as kind of a compilation of different examples to inspire you and provide some new ideas about how to connect to the blueprint in the South Atlantic and the Southeast. We're basically sharing a lot of lessons learned that we've gathered from working with blueprint users for the last few years about the types of approaches and wording and maps that are most helpful for various situations. So in this web forum, I'll hit the highlights of these guides and go over some case studies, and then we will also have time for input at the end about what's working and what's missing so that we can improve them over time. I'm very curious to get input from the broader web community on how they see themselves or their staff using these guides and what additions and improvements would be good to pursue. So that's next month's web forum. Other updates from staff this month, as you may have seen in the February newsletter, Final Southeast Blueprint 3.0 has been officially released. This is the blueprint for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. Rua did a great blog about it on the CCAS website that you can check out. And Rua, do you want to comment a little bit on some of these improvements?
Yeah, so I think by popular request, there's a lot more folks wanting to use the blueprint beyond just the South Atlantic, but a broader integrated, this sort of Southeast version, and then beyond that. And Greg also sort of mentioned the interest in national stuff, which is something we're also working towards. So this is version 3, been putting a lot of more effort into this Southeast blueprint integration. For this version, we've got pulled in some new data from Texas and their crucial habitat assessment tools, so that fills in the gap of Texas. And so we've got now the whole continent from Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri up to West Virginia down to the Caribbean. So get good coverage. We've got a new data layer depicting blueprint input and overlap areas, which is fairly nice to see where the different pieces are coming spatially. So that's took a little bit to get together. We've got an integrated hubs and corridors layer for the South Atlantic and Appalachian subregions, and then hope to have something over an even larger area with the next update coming up. And we've got some improved threats and land use change layers, including urban growth and sea level inundation, but also a solar energy suitability layer in there covering the full Southeast, and then put a lot of time into getting documentation up to speed. And so we've greatly improved all that detail and how everything was put together and metadata and all that fun stuff. So that's version 3.0, and we're going to be, as far as stuff to work on for the next version of the blueprint, that's something we're going to be working on coming up. Pretty much we should have a better sense of it the next month or so. what will come out in the next version. But the plan is to release the next version of the Southeast Blueprint at the end of the year.
Yeah, we've typically been prepping the draft for the annual meeting at CIAPWA, and then get any feedback from that and make some final improvements and then get it out. We just were pushed back a little bit because of the shutdown. So that's the Southeast Blueprint. And then, Rua, do you also want to comment? We're in the process of prioritizing improvements for the South Atlantic Blueprint, which is just one of the inputs to that greater Southeast Blueprint.
Oh, yeah, and we got some fun stuff in store. So I've just got the big backlog. So all the improvements, stuff that gets suggested by you in meetings or even offhand, we track them all in a big backlog. And so every year we've been prioritizing them based on how important they are on the different blueprint uses, how often we get requested, how problematic they are related to known issues. So we'll probably we've basically got the prioritization sheets together and should hopefully have a good sense by next month of what kind of improvements will be in the next version of the South Atlantic Blueprint. A lot of cool stuff we've been looking into, including some finer resolution and a ton of really exciting stuff. So you'll hear more about that soon.
Improved indicators, potentially new indicators. It's all on the table. So. Yep, something to look forward to, and I'm sure we'll cover what's on deck for the Southeast Blueprint and for the South Atlantic Blueprint in one of our later web forums this year, so stay tuned. To wrap up, I always like to end on this slide. Remind people, please join the South Atlantic LCC web community to get a monthly reminder email about this web forum and to get our monthly newsletter. It's really the best way to stay up to date on what's happening in the South Atlantic, and we've been cross-posting a lot for developments with CCAS and the Southeast Blueprint as well, coming from the Southeast blog, Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategies blog. You can always reach out to members of your Blueprint staff. That's me and Louise and Amy and Mallory and Rua here in Raleigh, and we encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online. Reach out to us if you need help using it or if you have feedback on how to make it better. So with that, I will pause for questions one more time, either for your staff or for Greg, if something's occurred to you.
This is John Faustini. I had a question for Rua, or in general, I guess, regarding the Southeast Blueprint. I'm curious how consistent it is. I mean, there's obviously put together from different plans, so I'm wondering how that, what the dark blue means in one place versus another, for example. So, like I noticed Texas is a lot bluer than Georgia, for example. I know South Atlantic had a pretty strict criteria for the highest priority categories in terms of percentage of the area that could be included or something like that. So, could you talk about how that is, and is that are those differences easy to suss out?
Yeah, so in some level we have those, we've been documenting those in the known issues, and then also that's partly why we have that overlap layer to kind of look at it. So the two biggest known issues we have related to the overlap percentages, there's a few, the bigger ones, you can see the one in Texas and the one in West Virginia. And so we've been working actively on all of those. We're trying to basically spatially to have them an equal amount in high and highest, or high and medium across those, and get them to mean basically the same kind of high conservation value, medium conservation value things. Texas in particular, that's one of the things we hope to work on this year in the update. There are just some fundamentally different ways one of the biggest things is fundamentally different ways of prioritizing grasslands, either based on on-the-ground data, which is imperfect because you don't have all of them, but can really tell you quality, versus broad-scale GIS, which is terrible at telling you quality. And so you end up with this sort of, just the basic current rules we have for integration say if it's in one, it's in both. And that's obviously something we need to revisit in this next version, because you end up with something like Texas being really high. So that is something we're actively working on, stitching those together. In general, across all these, we're trying to get them to maybe not this, not exactly the same type of apple, but similar breeds of apple together as we integrate them. It's like, yeah, it's a Fuji and it's a Honeycrisp, but it's like, yeah, we're putting them together and it's still apples, but just maybe slightly different. So yeah, that's stuff we've been documenting in the known issues, and if you get specific places, I'm glad to talk with you about that. But that's the next big update, that balance we're trying to bring together. Same thing with things like corridors and other sub-layers we've been trying to pull out. And we're also working on balancing out consistencies and things like aquatic assessments and terrestrial assessments and the ecosystem boundaries too, to try to let you slice out, okay, well, let's just pull out the aquatic prioritizations from this and do that on, say, have the similar kind of apples to apples underneath the hood of that broader area. So it's definitely a work in progress. Some areas sync together better than others, and we've been doing a lot more digging deep with various folks at different levels to try to understand some of the differences and where they line up and where they don't. Some good stuff going on in Louisiana and Tennessee that would be a little longer conversation, but kind of really interesting looking at different priorities and seeing, where they connect. So it's pretty well connected in some places where things overlap and now corridors connect to each other even when they cut across boundaries and hubs are the same. But other places still need more work. As a general rule, I would say the western part needs more work than the eastern part right now.
Part of what's going on, just to add to that a little bit, is, Rua touched on this, the way we handle two plans when they both cover the same area, but they don't have 100% agreement on where the priorities are. The points of contact from all of the state wildlife agencies in the Southeast, as well as the federal points of contact from basically all the federal natural resource agencies working in the Southeast, we asked them to vote on how they would like to handle those disagreements in these integration and overlap areas. And they basically said, let's err on the side of including more rather than less. So like Rua said, we include both plans. And so in areas where we have multiple plans overlapping and disagreeing, Texas is one of those, you do end up with more prioritization than we'd want. I think our goal is to have the high conservation value cover 20% of the geography and the medium cover the kind of 30% next best below that. And the inputs themselves, I think we have pretty close to that. It's just that when those inputs disagree, the aggregate ends up over prioritizing those areas. And we've actually crunched the numbers on how over prioritized they are, and that is documented in the metadata that's now available on the CPA and in a report that you can download with the CCAS data. And in terms of kind of what the methods are for each of the blueprint inputs, we kind of push you to learn more about each of the plans and kind of direct you to go to the website for that input plan to learn more about the methods that underlie it. But like Rua said, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, and those are areas we're trying to dig deeper into, the ones where we do have a lot. And in some cases, some smaller overlap zones, it may not be over-prioritized, but others we know it is. Like, I think there's still some question marks about, say, the Big Bend of Florida. There's a lot of prioritization in there, but that's because a lot of different plans want to include it because it's the Big Bend of Florida and it's a high-priority area. Yeah. So some of them have a high prioritization. It may just be, just a function of the ecology and other things. Other places have a lot of priority, and it's kind of a known related to the plan. So we're going to be zeroing in a lot of those places that have the documented the metadata that sort of have a really high percentage of priority within that overlap zone, and see, okay, what can we do about that? How much of this is just, okay, that makes sense, and how much of that is just a product of those current rules we have, and how do we fix it?
It might have been more answer than you bargained for, but that was a great question.
No, it's good.
It's something we've been thinking a lot about lately. So,
yep.
Anybody else?
Great.
I mean, essentially when you're using the Southeast Blueprint, as long as you're using it in an area that is contained within one of the plans, like if you're using the Southeast Blueprint in the South Atlantic, you're essentially using the South Atlantic Blueprint, just classified kind of a different way. Where the Southeast Blueprint becomes really, really helpful is when you need to use the blueprint in an area that's straddled by those multiple plans, because it kind of does the reconciling and the integrating for you. And we have had a couple of cases where, a parcel that someone's looking to include in a grant is split across the South Atlantic and the Appalachians, and so the Southeast Blueprint becomes super helpful for those kind of boundary straddling cases and for big regional cases where you need like a more consistent approach across the entire region. All right, any other questions? If not, I say we call it a day. 10:57. Enjoy your extra 3 minutes before your 11 o'clock conference call that you probably have. It's great to see everyone on the line today, and hope that you can join us in March.